Today would have been my sister's 35th birthday. She passed away almost 4 years ago from a drug overdose, and I've been wanting to do a video or blog or something to talk about her, what led to her addiction, and how she died. I'm hoping her story may help other addicts or people who have lost loved ones to addiction. My siblings and I had a very traumatic childhood, which is what I believe drove my sister to addiction. I think it was her way to cope with PTSD. The drug that she overdosed from in 2016 was heroin that was laced with fentanyl, but she started using drugs at the age of 11. She started out with marijuana, and by the time she was 15, she was using muscle relaxers and painkillers. She was also a heavy drinker, and at some point in her late teens, she used cocaine. I'm not sure when exactly she started using heroin, but I do know she started using that when she couldn't get her hands on prescription painkillers anymore. I had always known she used drugs recreationally, and when we were younger, I tried to convince her to stop and get help, but I eventually gave up. She was simply going to do what she wanted to do, and I couldn't stop her. For the longest time, she was what some would call a functional addict, and I didn't know just how bad her addiction was until she was arrested for grand larceny in 2014. She had lost her job a few months before she was arrested. She and her partner at the time, who was also a heavy addict, had been stealing very expensive items from warehouses and reselling them. My sister openly admitted at the time all she cared about was how she was going to get her next fix. She was found guilty and sentenced to jail for a few months, followed by a probation period. Her time in jail kind of served as a detox period for her. After she got out, she moved in with a childhood friend who had offered to take her in and help her. She never went to rehab or anything like that. She figured she could beat her addiction on her own. Thankfully, the codependent relationship she was in before the arrest had dissolved. She spent about a year living with her friend and was able to start piecing her life back together. She started working again and seeing other people, but the living situation with her friend got a little complicated, so she decided to move out in the fall of 2015. She then moved in with her mom for about 2 weeks, but it didn't work out. After that, she stayed with friends who would let her crash on their couch, or she would sleep in her car. When I learned about her living situation, or lack thereof, I told her she could stay with me anytime. We lived in different states, so commuting to work would have been impossible for her, and it also would have interfered with her probation. In November of 2015 was the second to last time I saw my sister alive. We went out to dinner with a friend, and I asked her if everything was okay. She insisted everything was fine and she had conquered her addiction. Her only dilemma was finding an affordable place to live. In early 2016, my sister and two younger brothers were technically homeless. My youngest brother slept in his car, and my other brother lived in a tent. My dad offered to take in my sister and youngest brother since they both had jobs and a car to get to work. The agreement was that they could stay with my dad and his wife for 6 months to find a place to live. For reasons I don't know, they were both kicked out before the 6 months were up, and they both ended up living in their cars again. In May of 2016, my sister started staying with a friend she had known since high school. She didn't have a room of her own, but her friend welcomed her to sleep on his couch whenever she needed. Unfortunately, about a month later, my sister relapsed on heroin. I had suspected she relapsed because she was posting vague updates on social media and was hanging out with people who were known addicts. The last time I talked to my sister, she asked me if she could come visit for a few days. She started talking to someone who lived about an hour and a half from me, and she wanted to come see me and bring along her new friend to check out New York. I told her she was welcome anytime and to just let me know when she was coming. I sometimes feel like I failed as a sister because I knew in my gut that something was wrong. and she wasn't telling me everything. My sister and I weren't intensely close, but we did have a good relationship. I didn't find out until after her passing, but not long after her relapse, she lost her job and started stealing again. She had also stopped making payments on her car and it was repossessed. A few days before she died, she asked my dad for money to get her car back. My dad gave her the money, but instead of picking up her car, she went and bought drugs. At the time, only a few people knew she had relapsed on heroin, so my dad gave her the money in good faith, but soon wished he had picked up her car for her instead of giving her the cash. On July 25th, 2016, I got a text from my dad that said, "Your sister is in the hospital on life support. It does not look good for her." When I read the message, I didn't know what to think. My dad was being vague and I thought he was exaggerating, so I called him. He told me my sister had overdosed on heroin and was taken to the hospital. They had done an x-ray of her brain that indicated she had gone too long without oxygen, so recovery was very unlikely. The hospital was going to give her 2 days before officially pronouncing her brain dead, but the odds were against her. This was the first time hearing that my sister had in fact relapsed, but I still didn't want to believe it. The friend she was staying with had found her in the bathroom that afternoon, slumped over in the toilet and not breathing. He performed what CPR he knew, and his girlfriend called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they were able to get a heartbeat, but she was not breathing on her own. She had also started shaking and opened her eyes, but her pupils were not responding to light. When I was told she had a heartbeat and that she hadn't been declared brain dead yet, I had hoped she was going to survive. I told my boss that my sister was in the hospital, but I wasn't sure if I needed to leave town right away. Looking back, I knew I was in denial over how dire the situation really was. If I continued my day-to-day activities, my sister would miraculously recover on her own and things would go back to normal. I had convinced myself that she may have suffered brain damage, but it was not her time to die. I remember calling everyone my sister knew that day, hoping to find a friend or family member that would tell me they had seen my sister and that she was going to be okay. Some people were hopeful. Others had already given up because she was an organ donor and the hospital had already started doing blood tests to find matches for viable organs. I wanted to remain optimistic despite the negativity I was receiving from a few people. My optimism completely dwindled the next day when I got a call from one of my sister's best friends. She told me the doctors were keeping my sister on life support because they needed her organs. That was all. I immediately called my boss and told her I needed to leave town because my sister had in fact died. I packed a small bag and went straight to the bus station to get an overnight ticket to go home. I called my dad and told him what time I would be in town and asked if he could pick me up. I wasn't able to sleep on the bus, but I wasn't tired. I cried throughout the whole ride until I got into town a little after 7 a.m. My dad picked me up and said he would take me straight to the hospital to see my sister. We arrived around 8:30 a.m., and my mom was alone with her in the hospital room. My mom approached me and told me they had just declared my sister brain dead 10 minutes before we got there. I pulled away from my mom, asking to see my sister. I wasn't looking for consolation. I wanted to see for myself that my sister was in fact dead. I knew as soon as I touched her that my sister was gone. There was no life in her at all. I wrapped my hands around her face and kissed her forehead, but she didn't flinch or anything. I squeezed her hand, hoping she would squeeze back, but nothing at all happened. Her body laid in front of me, lifeless, and the only sound I heard was the breathing machine inflating her lungs. I vaguely remember my parents' presence in the room and didn't even realize my dad was trying to hug me as I held my sister's hand. I spent the rest of that day hopelessly sitting next to my sister. Visitors came to give their condolences, and the friend who my sister had been staying with sent his girlfriend to talk to anyone about what had happened. I'm not going to get into it, but there was a lot of finger-pointing and accusations made regarding my sister's death. The hard truth is that my sister was an addict who had taken heroin laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid when not administered correctly by doctors can be deadly. In 2016, there were 63,632 drug overdose deaths in the United States. 66.4% of those deaths involved an opioid. I wish my sister had been given better opportunities. I wish one of my parents had paid for her to go to rehab since she couldn't afford it on her own. I feel like many people had dismissed her as a terrible person and a waste of life because she used drugs. The fact is, my sister used drugs as a way to cope with the horrible things we went through when we were kids. Not every addict suffered from childhood abuse, but many have. She never went to therapy as an adult, even after she was arrested and spent time in jail. Therapy and rehab are both expensive, and at the time of her death, my sister was not insured. I don't know how to fix the opioid problem that has taken over the United States. I hope that by sharing my sister's story, maybe I can shed a little light on what an addict goes through. It hurts that no matter what I do, I cannot bring her back, but I have finally gotten to the point where I can talk about my sister without getting upset. I hope her story can help someone.